Good morning, everybody. It's very nice to be here talking to you this morning about a very important subject. Aina has given a very good background to some of the problems that we're facing in terms of our environmental situation. And so what I was going to talk to you about this morning, as the intro said, I work for the Irish Wildlife Trust, which is a non-governmental organisation. We've been working in the field of, as Aina said, we didn't call it biodiversity, we called it wildlife and we called it nature. But we use the word biodiversity now as well, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's gaining a bit of traction. But that's basically what we've been doing for the last, since 1979 actually. Some of you in the audience might be of an age that you remember Eamon de Butler and Gerrit van Gelderen. They were among the founders of the Irish Wildlife Trust. And it gives you a flavour maybe just of how long this battle has been going on for, the amount of work, the amount of decades that have gone into trying to raise the alarm about the collapse of the living world. So I'm going to talk to you today mostly about biodiversity. I know John is coming after me and he'll talk about climate. But what I wanted to do really was to emphasize that yes, we have a climate crisis. Yes, we have a biodiversity crisis, but actually it's much worse than that, believe it or not. We have multiple crises, and they're not separate from each other. Now, our friends in the scientific community have tried to actually quantify the scale of our planetary crisis by identifying what are called planetary boundaries. So, if we look at the history of humanity, farming developed about 5,000 years ago. Modern human civilization basically developed in that period. It's not a very long space of time. So, over the eons, yes, we've had ice ages and we've had, mass extinctions in the past. But human civilization has basically developed in a very stable climatic and ecological envelope. And what is happening now is we're bursting through that envelope and what the scientists refer to as planetary boundaries. And you can see the graph there in front of you. And so they identified what are the main planetary boundaries that we rely on for the continuation of human civilization as we know it. And you'll see some of them will be familiar to you. Climate change is there. The biosphere integrity refers to biodiversity that I'll talk about later. We see land system change. This means kind of converting forests into farms primarily. The use of fresh water. What I refer to here is biogeochemical flows, which sounds quite technical, but really what they're saying there is that an awful lot of chemicals which are used on the land, particularly fertilizers like phosphates and nitrates. Nitrate is now taken out of the air using a chemical process. It's put on the land. An awful lot of it ends up in our waterways and back in the ocean. And so it's disrupting basically the chemistry of the oceans. We have ocean acidification, and this is happening because the increase in concentration in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is getting dissolved in the water, and that's creating carbonic acid, and basically it's making the oceans more acid. And this is a very big problem for many of the creatures that live in the ocean, particularly those that have shells, which are based on basically calcium carbonate, which is like the scale in your kettle. And if the ocean gets more acidic, it's going to get harder for those creatures to build shells. And that obviously has huge ramifications for life in the ocean. The oceans produce about half of the oxygen in the atmosphere. And so you can see already that the interconnections between the various issues that we face. One of them there is about aerosol loading. Some of us will remember the ozone layer and the issue to do with aerosol gases. And this one here, the last one here, is called novel entities. And novel entities are the massive increase in the production of synthetic chemicals, particularly since the end of the Second World War. many of which we don't know what kind of effect it has on biology. Aina talked about the neonicotinoids and the insecticides and so on. We have thousands and thousands of these chemicals now in the atmosphere, in the water, in our soil, in our bodies, and we really know very little about them. Now, what the people in the Stockholm Resilience Centre here, this graph is actually a few years old, but when they drew this graph, they said that we had already burst through the limit on biosphere integrity. In other words, the biosphere is already so damaged that it can't sustain human life as we know it on this trajectory. It has also said land system change, and of course, if you convert a rich biodiverse forest into a farm, that's going to affect the biosphere integrity as well, and also on biogeochemical flows. And this won't be strange to us here in Ireland. We know that half of our rivers are polluted, and that's mostly from nutrients from agriculture as well as human runoff, and that's getting into the sea. But globally, this is such a big problem. We now have dead zones. We have a number of dead zones around the world, like the Baltic Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, and others, where basically life is either non-existent or it's struggling to exist. Now, as I say, this graph is old. In the last 6 months, the people who work at this institute in Germany or this in Sweden have identified that we have broken through another 2 of these boundaries only in the last 6 months. One of those is to do with novel entities, and the other one is to do with freshwater use. And of course, with climate change, we see increased extreme weather. We now have I've heard the term aridification. It's not even droughts now in places like the Mediterranean basin in the southwest USA. Basically, they are desertifying because of climate change and all these other pressures. And of course, places like the Colorado River in the US, they've taken so much water out of that river that it hasn't even reached the sea for much of the last 30 or 40 years. So the point about this graph is that it is not possible really to look at one of our environmental problems in isolation. So we shouldn't be looking at this as saying, okay, we'll deal with climate change now, and then we'll deal with the biodiversity thing later, and then we'll maybe get around to dealing with fresh water. We have to deal with it as a system, and we have to deal with all of these problems simultaneously and recognize the interconnections. Now, it's important also to recognize that humans and our societies are part of those interconnections. And we all have basic human needs. We need to feed, we need somewhere to live, we want our children to have an education. Basically, we all want a good life. So the challenge really for us for this century is how can we, for us it's about how can we maintain a good life. For many people in the developing world, it's about how can they attain a good life, and how can we do that while reducing our pressure on the biosphere so that we don't end up with runaway climate change and ecological breakdown, so that we just simply won't be possible to have a safe climate and a good life for the majority of people on Earth. So these people in Leeds in the UK have come up with a system called the donut, and it was prompted by a book by an economist called Kate Raworth, who devised this idea of donut economics. And it was about how can we transform our economic system and our social system to get inside the donut, providing a good life for people without killing the planet. And they looked at not only the planetary boundaries that I just talked about, but the social boundaries. And you'll see this graph here on the right-hand side is the donut for Ireland, and you can see that we pretty much meet all of the social criteria. Yes, there are inequalities in Ireland, but compared to other countries, we're doing pretty well. But we have blasted through pretty much all of the environmental boundaries that are available to us in Ireland, on CO2 emissions, on phosphorus and nitrogen, our ecological footprint, and the amount of materials that we're using. So this is important, and you'll see that when you compare Ireland to other countries, you can see we're right up there in the top corner. And so you'll see there's a group of countries that are pretty much in the Western world, maybe Japan as well, that are doing well off, providing a decent life for their people, but are not, they are using up the environmental resources of the planet. And then you have another bunch of countries down at the bottom that can't provide for their people and yet are living in an environmentally sustainable way. And this, of course, is a problem. And this leads us to this idea of climate justice. And I think this is really important because we have to acknowledge the human element in this, even though, I mean, I'm immersed in the issue of biodiversity and ecosystems most of the time. But we are part of nature and we are part of this system. And we have to make it work for ourselves as well as all the other living creatures on this planet. And so you'll see, I just took some figures here. I got this off the internet yesterday. And you'll see there's great inequality. This is just to do with CO2 emissions. And it's enormous inequality in the amount of CO2 emissions that we emit. For 2020, Ireland per person emitted 6.75, I think that's tons per annum. Yes, tons per annum per person. And in Spain, they emitted 4.47, so a good bit less than in Ireland. And if you go to Ethiopia, your average Ethiopian emitted 0.13 tons of CO2 per person. That's 52 times less than the average Irish person. This is important every time you hear somebody talking about, what about China and what about other people? And Ireland is small and there's no point in us doing anything. Ireland has exerted an overwhelming influence on this problem, and it also means we have an overriding moral duty to act first on this crisis. Now, I appreciate the text is very small in this, but really what I want you to look at is the shape of these graphs. Now, this came from a report by the World Wildlife Fund and the Zoological Society of London, and it basically describes what is called the Great Acceleration. So this, Aina showed the graph earlier of the temperatures going up, and really everything has been going up, not just temperatures. And the graphs show, I won't read out all of them, but I'll give you an example. It's world population, it's world GDP, it's the fertilizer use, it's paper production, it's the amount of marine fish that have been captured, it's shrimp, aquaculture, methane, transportation, the number of large dams in the world. Everything has just gone off the charts. And you can see the shape of that is known as an exponential curve, that kind of ski jump style. It's 50 years since a book was written called The Limits to Growth, which talked about this exponential shape of development. And they basically, 50 years ago, they said, this can't continue. We only have one planet. The idea that we can keep growing on an exponential pathway indefinitely is simply not physically possible. They were absolutely laughed at and ridiculed at the time, but their projections are proving to be eerily accurate. And what they predicted, what they modeled was that without a change in trajectory of these graphs, basically human civilization as we know it could not survive the end of this century. Now that is completely related to our consumption, so it's not just our burning of greenhouse gases, it's our general consumption patterns. And this is a very similar graph to the one I showed you of CO2 emissions per person. And you can see that basically it's Western countries and so on. You'll see Ireland is one of the few very dark purple countries in Europe even. So our consumption rates in Ireland are way over the world average. Now, I said I'd talk about biodiversity, I will. And biodiversity, to me, is one of the most fascinating things there is, because it differs fundamentally from our discussion about climate in one way. The change in our climate results from changes to the atmosphere through greenhouse gases. It's basically a physical process in the atmosphere that was described by physicists back in the 1950s. And there's a handful of greenhouse gases. We can measure them, we can track them. Every year we get a report from the EPA in Ireland about our greenhouse gas emissions. And theoretically, even though we're not doing it, theoretically it's manageable and we can track and trace it. Biodiversity is not possible to understand. It is what is referred to as a complex system. It's so complicated that nobody knows how it works, basically. It has so many parts to it that it can't be described. And these parts interact with each other in ways that also can't be described. And also, it's a self-generating system. So in the old days, if you go back to the 1700s during the Enlightenment, they liked to describe nature as a machine. They had this picture of Isaac Newton with the stars and the cogs and the wheels behind the planets. But nature isn't a machine. Machines are complicated. Humans put them together. Maybe lots of us don't understand how our cars work, but lots of other people do. They can be taken apart. Machines ultimately fall apart. They always do. Nature regenerates itself. It reforms itself. It evolves over millions of years. So ultimately, we can't understand it. Now, that's not to say we don't know an awful lot about it, because it has been subject to an awful lot of study. But almost the more we learn, the more we realize that we don't know. And nature is pretty much everywhere. It's in this room, it's in our gut, it's in the trees outside, it's in the soil, it's in the air. And over millennia, nature has formed natural ecosystems. Now, these ecosystems tend to be, as I say, self-regulating. They're dynamic. And I'm thinking of things like rivers, forests, ocean systems. They're full of different types of plants and animals. That's the biodiversity that holds it together. And they live in environments that are managed by, let's say, physical properties, whether that's water or air or so on. And you'll see, so what has happened in the last 50 years, this graph also comes from the World Wildlife Fund, and they've been measuring the abundance of vertebrate life on Earth. So vertebrates are, like ourselves, creatures with backbone. So it's not an entire proxy of biodiversity. So mammals, fish and frogs and so on. And it has shown that since 1970, the abundance of these creatures has declined by nearly 70%. There's a new one of these reports. This is from 2020. There'll be a new one in 2022, later this year. I can't imagine they'll have solved all their problems by October. So in my lifetime, I was born in 1973. In my lifetime, and the Earth was not pristine in 1973, the amount of large vertebrate life has basically collapsed. Now, this is also to be found in the insect world. There's more and more studies coming out now about the collapse of insect life. And basically, this is in relation to the destruction of ecosystems. So that's pretty much the global place where we're at the moment. Now, I wanted to talk about Ireland and what has happened to nature in Ireland. Because a lot of people, I think, have grown up looking at this when you drive through the countryside and we're told it's green, it's healthy, Ireland is wild, we've fresh air, we've lots of weather, we're surrounded by ocean, all is well in the world. And this has been used to sell our image abroad as a tourist destination, and it's been used to sell our food, particularly abroad for food exports, and a lot of us have believed it. But actually, nature in Ireland has collapsed. And in particular, we do not have natural ecosystems in Ireland anymore. And this possibly comes as a bit of a lance to people. And a lot of people might say, well, why is that? Why is that a problem? Particularly because, okay, so we've destroyed our natural ecosystems, and you're telling us that nature is absolutely vital to our lives and how we live. But yet, here we are. I can go to the supermarket and everything is abundant and cheap, and life goes on. But in reality, what has happened is now that we've destroyed our own ecosystems, our consumption patterns means that we are relying on the destruction of ecosystems basically across the world. So if you go to the supermarket and you try to decipher what's in the products you're buying, you will find that it is products from the deep sea, from mines, from deforestation, from who knows where, pretty much. And that is all driving the collapse of ecosystems globally. And of course, if ecosystems globally collapse, well, that is pretty much a game over for human civilization as we know it. But we live where we do live, and we have to look at what we can do. And certainly, I think what we can do is address the problems we have here in Ireland. Now, back to our field. This field, hundreds of years ago, would have been dense, deciduous rainforest. Ireland was once 80% forest. That figure is now about 1%. So Ireland is probably one of the most deforested countries in the world. We look at horror at what's happening in Brazil and Indonesia, and yet we rarely recognize that actually we have done this to our own country, except that nobody remembers when Ireland was 80% forest. It happened so long ago. But when the forests were cleared and they were turned into pastures and cereal crops, the land was still fairly biodiverse. Yes, the forests had collapsed, but fields like this, even in County Louth in the 1960s, would have been full of wild flowers. They would have been referred to as weeds. It probably had birds nesting in the fields, in the center of the fields, like skylarks and quails, partridges, corncrakes, curlews, so on. The boundaries of the fields would have been dense hedgerows that would have provided refuge for a lot of the animals that used to live in the woodlands. And the soil would have been incredibly diverse. So there was a lot of life in those fields back in the 1960s. And of course, there was no chemical fertilizer or sprays being used. And so effectively there was no runoff into the local river. So pollution in those days was practically unheard of. But in that time, we have a complete transformation of the land and how it is used. The land has been drained. It has been applied with chemical nitrogen. And the problem with chemical nitrogen is that it promotes the growth of typically one type of grass. So basically it does what we want it to do with it. But basically the diversity in the plants and in the soil then nosedives. So you get these fields that basically have nothing in them. We then also went from a system where we were growing hay to feed animals to one where we were growing silage. And silage means you grow the grass quickly using nitrogen, and then you mow it probably around this time of year, and then the farmer will get another crop of silage maybe in 6 weeks' time. And that means there's no space for the ground nesting birds. So we've got about 100 pairs of curlews now left in Ireland, down from, I think it was about 2,000 in the 1980s. And that is largely to do with this transformation from haymaking to silage, because there's simply no refuge in these fields anymore. So these fields are not dead, as people are fond of pointing out to me sometimes. Sometimes there are dandelions in them. Sometimes there are buttercups in them. Sometimes you might find worms in them. But compared to the abundance and diversity of life that used to be in them, they are a total shadow of their former selves. And from an ecological system, from an ecological perspective, this system has collapsed. And that's a problem for our climate, because the nitrogen from the fertilizer is going into the atmosphere. An awful lot of an awful lot of fossil fuels go into making the nitrogen in the first place. And of course, then that runs off into our local river. Now you might say to me, okay, well, not all Ireland is green fields. Okay, maybe about 60% of Ireland is green fields. And about 20% of Ireland looks like this. What we might call the brown land as opposed to the green land. And if you look up at the Cooley Mountains there, this is what I'm talking about. This picture is from County Wicklow. And I remember when I was young growing up, this was where we believed the wilderness to be. The lowlands are civilized and you have farms and hedgerows. Up in the upland areas, you don't have any enclosures. It's brown, the weather is usually worse, and this is what people have associated as wild nature. But people used to live up in these mountainous areas, so they have been cultivated. They've also been completely deforested. We know that from pollen records and from charcoal deposits, where people went up and felled the forest to turn into charcoal because they were making iron. So this landscape would have been forested. The Cooley Mountains, for instance, would have been forested. Now there are also blanket bogs in these areas, and blanket bogs tend to be deep, wet peat, and they don't have forest. So maybe it wasn't complete forest, but there was a lot of forest. Then we had people living in these hills, and they used to be full of heather. These days, and I remember my parents talking about, trips up into the brown country, and they'd remark about how, purple the landscape would have been back in, late July and August. But these landscapes are not even purple anymore. They're just brown because they have been drained. They're typically burnt at least once a year, people setting fire to them, and that's related to agricultural practices. We have an awful lot of sheep on our mountains that are just free roaming and they're eating everything. And if they're not looking brown like that, we have planted them with plantations of non-native Sitka spruce forests. And again, these are degraded peatlands spewing out enormous quantities of greenhouse gases. The science suggests even that the figures we're using at the moment for the amount of greenhouse gases these landscapes are giving off are not accurate, that it's actually much worse than we have calculated. Now, in our lowlands, Ireland is obviously a wet country. When the water falls on the ground, it percolates through the soil or it runs off the concrete in the car park and it gets into our local river. So most of our water bodies, about half of our water bodies these days are polluted, but that's just a measure of the quality of the water in the river. It doesn't tell you about the health of the actual river ecosystem. Now, when I studied geography for my leaving cert, we learned that rivers come down quickly out of the mountains, and then when they reach the lowlands, they slow down and they start to meander. And we learned about oxbow lakes because when the meander gets too big, sometimes the river takes a shortcut and it leaves a little lake that's shaped like a horseshoe. I don't know why we learned that, because there are no oxbow lakes in Ireland, and that's because most of our rivers, certainly an awful lot of our rivers, have been straightened. The idea of rivers flooding, which they do naturally, and oxbow lakes, that was taking up farmland. Now, this was a problem in the post-war period when, food shortages were very real, and there was a huge impetus to increase the area of productive farmland. So farmers were instructed and incentivized to drain their fields, dig ditches around it, and also what was the predecessor to the Office of Public Works, the OPW, went out with heavy machinery and basically dug our rivers into canals. This picture I'm showing you is from the River Boyne, which is in a special area of conservation. So on a map, we're told that this is one of our most important areas for biodiversity. But it is fundamentally restructured. It's not a natural ecosystem, because you can see where on the sides of the bank the earth was scooped out and heaped up on either side. So the river just flows in a straight line, and you can see it has done what we asked, what was wanted of it. There's more farmland on either side of it. The problem is that when we get flooding, instead of the river slowly spilling out onto the floodplain and taking its time, now it's sluicing down the mountain, flashing through the fields and coming in pulses to our towns and our cities. So that's a problem for if you live downstream of this river, you're going to feel the problem with that flooding. It's also a problem for aquatic life in that river. Our salmon is threatened with extinction. Much of our aquatic life is threatened with extinction. But again, it's not dead, right? There are things will live in this, but basically as a functioning ecosystem, it has collapsed. Now you can see where I'm going with this, right? But this is a photograph of our raised bogs, and Ireland was once world famous for the amount of raised bogs that we have. Now, raised bogs, if you go up to the Cooley Mountains, you'll find bogs, but they're blanket bogs that tend to form in mountains or where you get an awful lot of rain. But in the lowland areas, particularly around the River Shannon, we had this very, very unique ecosystem that formed over thousands of years from shallow lakes that built up. Imagine like bread rising in a tin. The bog grew and grew and grew into these great big domes of peat. They hold an awful lot of water and they hold an awful lot of carbon. And of course, turf cutting is something that has gone on for a very long time. But in the post-war period, we developed the technology to completely strip mine our raised bogs. And we did that very effectively. I don't have my little pie chart here to show you, but basically the last time our scientists went out, and actually this figure now is probably even out of date, they found that 0.6% of our raised bog habitats were intact. Now, by intact, they meant these areas were still functionally growing peat. And that's very important for our climate debate, because we want ecosystems that are taking carbon out of the air and storing it away indefinitely. And a healthy bog will do that forever. But we only have 0.6% of our original area is still intact. And I believe that area is actually smaller, because even though we brought in laws to prohibit turf cutting on SACs, special areas of conservation. It's still going on about between a third and a half of those SACs still has illegal turf cutting on it. Now, my last misery slide, hopefully, is about the sea. And really, when I came to ecology quite late in life, and when I started looking at the devastation of what happened on land, I thought, well, surely the sea has been saved somehow. Surely this is our wilderness area. And when you go down to the beach, you're probably looking at exactly the same scene that somebody who stood there 200 years ago saw, because basically we can't see into the sea. And what a tragedy that is, because if we could see into the sea, we'd see that the ecosystems that were once absolutely brimming with life around the Irish coast have also collapsed. And a good example here for where we are today, there used to be an oyster bed stretching from the Cooley Peninsula almost down to Wexford. And over the space of about 60 years during the 1800s, that oyster bed was completely annihilated through dredging. Obviously, people like to eat oysters. There were no controls ever put in place on the dredging, and that oyster bed it's just not there anymore. So the ecosystem we're looking out on into the Irish Sea, when you look at it's a collapsed ecosystem. The Irish Sea, of course, like all the other seas around Ireland, are chronically overfished. And one of the main culprits for that, certainly not the only one, is bottom trawling. And bottom trawling is a method of catching fish where you basically weight a net to the bottom of the sea and drag it across the sea floor, and you catch everything in its path. It was enormously successful, and that's why an awful lot of bottom trawling happened, and it still happens. And these days, bottom trawling is the biggest source of waste fish. You've heard about discarding. This is where fishermen catch fish they don't want, so they dump it back in the sea. 96% of the discarding in the European Union comes from bottom trawling. An awful lot of our overfishing is because of bottom trawling, because it's indiscriminate. The fishermen are catching fish they don't want to catch. And we've recently learned that because they're dragging nets over areas of sediment that hold a lot of carbon, that when you bottom trawl, you're remineralizing this carbon dioxide into the water column. And it has been calculated that bottom trawling releases roughly the same amount of greenhouse gases as the entire aviation industry. Now, with all of those activities, with our farming and our peat mining and our river dredging and our bottom trawling, that has led to an awful lot of extinction in Ireland. When I was writing my book, I did some research on this, and I calculated that we can document about 120 types of plants and animals that have gone extinct from Ireland since the arrival of humans. Some of these you'll have heard of before, like bears and wolves and golden eagles. A lot of them are maybe animals that only nature lovers would be familiar with, like this wonderful bird, the capercaillie here, is an enormous turkey-like creature that used to live in our forests. We used to have right whales coming in very close to the shore of Donegal, where they were hunted up until about 100 years ago. But an awful lot of the plants and animals that have gone extinct, really nobody has ever heard of before. They're really for specialists, mosses and fungi and so on. And of course, an awful lot will have gone extinct without anybody noticing, because there simply just weren't the people out there looking for them. But also what has happened, certainly in my lifetime, and this matches that graph I showed you earlier of the decline in vertebrate life of 68%, is how the remaining life in this country has gone from abundant and widespread to hanging on by a thread. And I've just put up some of the creatures here that fall into that category. And all of these creatures that I'm showing you here were probably found in County Louth. You had breeding curlews and corn buntings and corncrakes. Certainly when I was a child, the rivers were full of eels. The eels are now critically endangered. The salmon, of course, there's a great connection here between the salmon and County Louth, and the salmon is an endangered species as well because of the pollution, the arterial drainage, the dams, the fishing out at sea, all the rest of it. So this is, I've possibly driven the mood down in the room here a bit, but I often say, like, if you're not depressed by this, then I haven't done my job, because it is depressing. But there's a but coming, right? And the but is that it's not a case that all is lost. We still have an awful lot that we can save. And I go back to this slide here because all of these creatures are still out there. And once a creature is extinct, it's extinct forever. So the great auk, for instance, was rather like a penguin that used to live around the shores of Ireland. It's completely extinct globally, and that will never come back. But pretty much everything else that has gone extinct from Ireland is out there somewhere, and we could bring them back if we want to. And we have brought back golden eagles, we have brought back white-tailed eagles. We can do this stuff if we want to. Nature pretty much needs time and space. We have huge advantages here in Ireland. I believe we have wonderful communities. We have fantastic community spirit and very active, determined communities when they want to be. We have great scientific community. I believe we have a great activist community. I would say that because I'm in it, but I believe we do. I believe there's a great desire among people when they're given this information to be motivated to do something about it. And the good news is that we have the tools to address this problem. We know how to farm without using chemical nitrogen, for instance, or pesticides. That's not the third secret of Fatima. We know, there are farmers doing it out there. We know how to restore bogs. If we took the sheep down off the Cooley Mountains, the trees would come back, the forest would restore itself. We don't even need to plant trees half the time because species like birch, for instance, were very quick to colonize. We simply need to give these places some time and space. A lot of the plantation conifers, if you go up to Ravensdale and walk around there, you'll notice that it's mostly a dark, forbidding conifer plantation. But we know that those places can be converted, and as long as the soil is reasonably healthy underneath it, we can re-establish the forest, we can re-establish the bogs. We can clean up our rivers, we can remove dams, we can do all this. And I think that would actually be one of the most positive, inspiring projects that this country could get behind over the coming decades, because I appreciate an awful lot of what I've said is quite gloomy. And by the way, John is coming after me, so it's not the end of the gloom for you. And what people want, I think, is action. What we get from the government is inaction. And that has been the most frustrating place for me as an activist. When you have the tools, you say, we know what we need to do, we know how to do it, why are we not actually doing it? So I think that if we could, come together as a community to recognize the gravity of the problem, the scale of the opportunity, the need to get on and do it, not only for ourselves, but for the generations coming after us, then I think that would be an amazingly positive project to get behind. I'm going to finish up now, but I mean, the picture I have here is I did a podcast series last year called Shaping New Mountains, and I worked with an artist to try and imagine what Ireland could look like in the future. And this is one of the drawings we came up with together, and it's supposed to depict, a farmland that could be anywhere in Ireland. But the hills have forests in them. The rivers have salmon and freshwater pearl mussels in them. We have farmers, but they're not all beef farmers or dairy farmers. We have farmers growing fruit and vegetables. We have farmers maybe cultivating bees and honey, and maybe some beef as well and dairy as well. We don't have to eliminate anything, but we do need to rebalance the system. So thank you very much for listening.